Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of Starrcade 1991. Starting off the evening, we'll go to our first match of the night. It is Jimmy Garvin and Marcus Bagwell versus Michael P.S. Hayes and Tracy Smothers. Number one, I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Jimmy Garvin and Marcus Bagwell keeping the pace of the match. But Marcus ultimately hits a devastating fisherman suplex on Tracy Smothers, pins him for the three, and your winners of the match are Jimmy Garvin and Marcus Bagwell. Hats off to Jimmy Garvin and Marcus Bagwell for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Rick Rude and Steve Austin versus Big Josh and Van Hammer. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Rude and Austin keeping the pace of the match. Josh then hits a power slam on Rude in the middle of the ring, but Rude ultimately hits his Rude Awakening, pins for the three, and your winners of the match are Rick Rude and Steve Austin. Hats off to Rick Rude and Steve Austin for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Dustin Rhodes and Richard Morton versus El Gigante and Larry Zbyszko. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Dustin and Morton keeping the pace of the match. El Gigante then attacks Zbyszko. Then Dustin and Morton both hit a double drop kick on Zbyszko, pins him for the three, and your winners of the match are Dustin Rhodes and Richard Morton. Hats off to Dustin Rhodes and Richard Morton for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Jushin Thunder Liger and Bill Kazmaier versus Mike Graham and Diamond Dallas Page. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Liger and Kazmaier keeping the pace of the match. Liger then hits a spin kick. Liger then ultimately hits the finish, pins for the three, and your winners of the match are Jushin Thunder Liger and Bill Kazmaier. Hats off to Jushin Thunder Liger and Bill Kazmaier for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Lex Luger and Arn Anderson versus the Z-Man and Terrence Taylor. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Z-Man hitting a devastating enziguri on Arn Anderson. Z-Man and Taylor both keeping the pace of the match. Lex then hits a press slam on Taylor. Then Lex ultimately hits a devastating pile driver on Terrence Taylor, pins him for the three, and your winners of the match are Lex Luger and Arn Anderson. Hats off to Lex Luger and Arn Anderson for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Todd Champion and Ricky the Dragon Steamboat versus Cactus Jack and Sergeant Parker. Before the match even takes place, Abdullah ends up attacking Sergeant Parker backstage. The match itself, it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and Todd Champion keeping the pace of the match. Parker finally finds his way back to the ring, but Ricky ultimately hits a crossbody, pins for the three, and your winners of the match are Todd Champion and Ricky Steamboat. Hats off to Todd Champion and Ricky Steamboat for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Bobby Eaton and Brian Pillman versus Abdullah and Sting. Before the match even gets started, Abdullah ends up attacking Sting ringside. The match itself, it was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Eaton keeping the pace of the match. Cactus Jack is here. He makes his way down to the ring. Cactus then goes to hit Sting but missed and hit Abdullah. Sting then capitalizes on that. It hits a crossbody on Eaton. Pins him for the three. And your winners of the match are Abdullah and Sting. Hats off to Sting and Abdullah for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night as well. It is Rick Steiner and Night Stalker versus Mr. Hughes and Vader. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Rick Steiner keeping the pace of the match. But Vader ultimately hits a devastating splash on the Night Stalker, pins him for the three, and your winners of the match are Vader and Mr. Hughes. Hats off to Vader and Mr. Hughes for getting a win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Johnny B. Bad and Arachnaman versus Firebreaker Chip and Scott Steiner. The match itself was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Johnny B. Bad keeping the pace of the match. Scott ultimately hits an overhead belly-to-belly suplex, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Firebreaker Chip and Scott Steiner. Hats off to Firebreaker Chip and Scott Steiner for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Ron Simmons and Tommy Rich versus PN News and Steve Armstrong. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Ron hitting a devastating press slam on Armstrong. Ron was keeping the pace of the match, with Ron ultimately hitting a devastating spine buster. Pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are Ron Simmons and Tommy Rich. Hats off to Ron Simmons and Tommy Rich for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Starrcade 1991. It is the Battle Bowl matchup. It's pretty much a full-on Battle Royal. It was a decent matchup, back-and-forth matchup with everybody involved in this matchup. Sting and Lex Luger were actually the last 2 competitors in this match, with Sting ultimately eliminating Lex Luger to get the win. Couple of things I'm going to say about this, man, before I get out of here. Number one, Starrcade 1991 was awful. In my honest opinion, man, it was just a bad pay-per-view, in my honest opinion. I wasn't a big fan of the lottery that they had. It was pretty much called Starrcade 1991 Battle Bowl Lethal Lottery. That's what the pay-per-view was called. Where, Eric Bischoff, and at the time it was Eric Bischoff, Missy Hyatt, and I think Magnum TA, they were all drawing different cards, or names, if you will, out of this, lottery machine, if you will. And, yeah, at first it made it cool to have, tag teams that were, tag team partners go against each other. Like, for example, the Fabulous Freebirds. You got Jimmy Garvin teaming up with Marcus Bagwell to go up against Michael P.S. Hayes and Tracy Smothers. That was cool. But after that matchup, I mean, the quality of tag teams that were left on this card, man, were just awful. Prime example, Todd Champion. Don't know anything about him. And I feel like his career was really cut short. The other big name that popped in my head was Firebreaker Chip. Know nothing about Firebreaker Chip. And just the tag matches just were lackadaisical in my honest opinion, man. And to be honest with you, you can kind of tell who was going to win these tag matches before they even got started. Just with the talent they had there that night. I mean, it's to be honest with you, Juice and Thunder Liger and Bill Kazmaier, yeah, they got the win. But on paper, Liger's probably better than both Mike Ram and DDP, hands down. So, I mean, I definitely seen Liger getting the win in that tag team matchup. Same thing with Lex Luger and Arn Anderson. There was no way in hell that Lex Luger and Arn Anderson were going to lose to the Z-Man and Terrence Taylor. No shot. Absolutely no way that was going to happen. But it's a shame, man, because Starrcade, to me, Starrcade for WCW, for me at least, was always their WrestleMania. It was always the best versus the best at Starrcade. Now, yeah, technically it wasn't, the same month that the WrestleMania would be. Usually Starrcade, for what I remember back in the day, it was always around Thanksgiving. But Starrcade always put on solid, events, and this was not one of them, man. This was very lackadaisical. I didn't like the tag team format leading up to the Battle Bowl. I was not a big fan of it. And to be honest with you, I'm not a big fan of the gimmick matches, man. I just feel like they're awful and they're not needed, especially for a pay-per-view. But if I had to give Starrcade 1991 a solid rating from 1 out of 10, I'm probably going to have to give it a solid 4 at best, man. Like I stated earlier, big fan of the Starrcades, but this was definitely one of those Starrcades that I was not a big fan of. I feel like it was definitely lackadaisical, and the booking was just awful. So I'm going to have to give Starrcade 1991 a solid 4 at best, man. But this is my review of Starrcade 1991. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classy.